Okay, welcome back. Now in this video we're going to open up a scene that I set up where we're going to see different shading models and dig deeper into the way that shaders work inside of XSI. So let's just jump into that. Let's go ahead and open a scene here, and the one that you want to look for is the one called shading models underscore start. So we'll open up that scene. Okay, pretty simple scene setup, nothing special here. We have a series of spheres, all just placed in front of the camera here. And if we go down here in the render toolbar, and if you're not in the render toolbar, just click up here in this menu and select the render, or you can hit 3 on the keyboard, which is the shortcut. Hit this preview button here, and it's going to do a preview render. And this is what we basically got. A simple light setup with some simple spheres, and each sphere has a different shader applied to it. So in this video, I'm going to take you through these different shaders. Now, these aren't all the shaders that are available in XSI. There's tons and tons of more shaders available to you. But I thought it would be a good idea just to come in here and explore just a handful of these shaders, just to give you a little bit more experience with shaders. And then after this, we're going to start working on actual projects and really getting our hands dirty inside of the exercise shader systems and really seeing how these things work. Okay, so here we have different spheres with different shaders applied to them. You'll see some of them look a lot different than others. For example, these two over here look a little bit different than the rest of these simple gray spheres. And then we have this bright white one. So what I'm going to do is go through all of them one by one. Let's close that and start to explain how these different shaders work and what they can be used for. So let's just go ahead and get started on this. If we hit Control and 7 to open up the Material Manager, you'll see we have all the shaders here. Now we have different types of shaders, the anisotropic, the blend, we have a constant shader, Cook Torrance, Lambert, and so on and so forth. Then we have these two funny looking ones over here. This first one is called the SSS Fast Simple Shader. It's a special mental ray phenomena shader that recreates and mimics objects that have subsurface scattering. Now, if you're totally new to the concept of subsurface scattering, don't worry, I'm going to be deciphering that for you in this tutorial. That would be the point of going through this whole introduction to the render tree tutorial from i3D. And then the next shader is the SSS Fast Skin Shader. Now, they may look similar, and even the names can easily be confused. However, they're two totally different shaders, although they do achieve pretty similar effects, but they can be used in different ways. And you'll be seeing that throughout this in this video. You'll be seeing a little bit of that, but when we get into doing an entire project based around subsurface scattering, you'll really get an idea for this. And then we have over here a straw shader, which very good at imitating metallic type objects. So let's close the Material Manager down. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to start with this first sphere up here. Just go ahead and click on it. You'll see the name over here and the name box right here on the right on the MCP. It'll say straws. So I named the spheres after the shaders that are applied to them, so it's easier to make your way through this scene. Okay, so in order to see the shader properties with the object selected, we're going to go over here to the render toolbar under the modify section. Click on this button that says shader. So it's pretty simple, right? And that opens up a PPG with the shader attributes for the shader that's attached to this object, which in this case is the straw shader. Now the next thing we want to do in order to be able to see what this shader looks like is draw a render region over this sphere. So hold down the Q key on the keyboard. Oops, sorry about that. Hold down Q on the keyboard, drag a square right here, and then let go. And XSI quickly goes and performs a quick render region. So we can see what this straw shader looks like on this sphere. So let's look at some of the parameters here real quickly. We have some different tabs up here. A tab for illumination, one for transparency and reflection, and then one for indirect illumination. Now we're not going to worry about indirect illumination because that's not going to apply to us throughout this tutorial. What we are going to worry about is different things like transparency and reflection and illumination. Transparency reflection, well, it does just that. It controls the transparency of this material. Reflection controls, well, the reflection of this shader. So, for example, if you want to do a surface that's very reflective, like a mirror, or maybe a very shiny car that's very, very clean and waxed and reflective, you can use these properties and these parameters to do that. So, for example, let's make this more transparent. Let's click on the color here and increase the color, and by doing that we'll make it more transparent. So now we can see in the render region it updates, and we can actually see through it and start to see the black background through this sphere. So let me make that opaque again. Okay, let's go over here to the illumination. Here in illumination we can change different things like the diffuse color, for example. Right now by default it's this neutral gray, but if you wanted it to be blue, you can just choose blue and it'll update and turn blue. Red will update and turn red. So it's pretty simple. We also have some specular attributes here. So specular is this specular highlight you see here from the lights in the scene. So if I turn that off, watch what happens. That specularity goes completely away. Now this looks more like a rubber type material, maybe like a rubber ball or something like that. Let me turn specular back on. The straw shader has a couple of attributes down here for the surface properties. We can change the smoothness of the surface and also the metalness or the metallic quality of the shader. So you can make it look a little bit more metallic, which you can see right there. It looks more metallic now, or less metallic. So now it kind of looks more like plastic if you look at it. Okay, let's close that PPG. So that's the straw shader, and the straw shader is very good for doing hard surfaces like metal or maybe even rubber or even plastic. So it just depends how you implement it and how you use it. Now let's hover over this yellow line. That's the border of the render region tool. You notice your mouse cursor changes icons. When that happens, just simply click with the left mouse button and drag over another sphere to keep reusing that same render region square. Okay, so now we're working with this other sphere down here. So let's click on it to select it. You notice the name is Fong. Let's go over here and click on the shader button in the render toolbar to open up the shader property page. Okay, so now we can see that this Fong shader has pretty much the same tabs, but it has different attributes. For example, you'll notice that down here in the specular section, the attributes are different than they were on the straw shader. Also, under diffuse, we have a property here for controlling the ambient quality of the shader, as opposed to the straws which didn't have that. Okay, so again, just like with the other shader that we just saw, the straw shader, we could change the diffuse color. Say if you wanted it to be green, you can make it green. If you want to take the specularity off, you can do that just by unchecking that box. Now it looks more like a rubber. If we turn that back on again, it looks more like plastic. And we could change the color of the specularity in this one. So for example, if you want the specular highlight to be, say, yellow, and that should give us a pretty interesting effect. Look at that. It's pretty interesting. We can also change the size of that specular highlight. For example, by default it's set to 50. Now if we crank that up really high, you notice that the specular highlight gets smaller and sharper. And again, we have transparency and reflection parameters, which work exactly like with the straw shader, where you can make it reflective or transparent or both. So if I make this reflective, notice it gets darker because it's reflecting the black background, and now you can see the reflection of the other spheres in the scene bouncing off of the surface of this Fong sphere. Okay, so let's close that. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Let's drag this over to the next sphere, and let's select that sphere. And this sphere is a Lambert. So let's open up its shader PPG. Now Lambert's a very, very simple shader. It's essentially a Fong or blend shader without any of the specular parameters. So you notice it looks just like rubber. It's good for doing diffuse surfaces. That is, surfaces that don't reflect, that are not shiny, don't have any specularity or any type of properties like that. Just a surface that's very flat shaded and well, it's just diffuse basically. So we have transparency and reflection, and we have illumination. It's pretty simple. I mean, all you get is diffuse and ambient, and that's pretty much it. That's the Lambert shader for you. So let's drag this over here to this other sphere. Select it. Okay, this is where things get interesting. This is the SSS Fast Skin Shader. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag here on this little blue handle of the render region window just to extend this render region so that it encompasses these two spheres that are together. I put them together on purpose. These are the two fast subsurface scattering shaders. Now the one on the left is the skin shader. The one on the right is the simple shader. So what's the difference between the two? Well, select the skin shader, the skin sphere, and then click on shader. And what that did was open up the Fong node, which is not what we want. So instead what we're going to do is just hit 7 on the keyboard to open up the render tree, select the skin shader, hit this refresh button here to load it up, and here it is. See, there's the Fong node we just opened up. That's not what we want to do. What we want to do is dig into this SSS fast skin node in our render tree. Okay, so what does this node do? Well, the skin and the simple subsurface scattering shaders are mental ray phenomena. Now, these special shaders perform, well, more interesting tasks. They're not simple like the Fong shader or the Lambert shader. These things actually perform a lot more calculations and take a lot more things into account when performing their shading. So, let's double click on the fast skin node to open up its PPG and start to investigate and look a little bit further into this and see what some of these things do. Okay? Now you notice that we have 3 different tabs. We have a diffuse tab, a specular tab, and an advanced settings tab. Now as you can see, there are a lot of different options and parameters involved when working with these special shaders. So they can be a little bit daunting to a beginner at first, and it takes time and experience to get used to these shaders and really learn what they can do, what they're capable of, and what you can go ahead and do with them. Because they have so many parameters, a lot of different effects can be achieved with these shaders. Now, in a nutshell, what would you use this shader for? Well, the fast skin shader is perfect for doing skin on, say, characters. Say if you're doing models of people and you want their skin to look photorealistic, you would use this skin shader to imitate the way that light interacts with human skin. But if you get creative, you can use this shader for tons of other things as well. For example, you can use it to create realistic looking monsters or zombies or, well, anything really you want. Really, you're limited only by your imagination. So just get creative in how you want to use this shader because it's not just for human skin, even though that's what the name indicates. So just keep in mind that you can use this shader for tons of different circumstances and situations and different types of projects. Now the different settings we have are we have some diffuse settings, then we have these other settings which are pretty interesting like epidermal scatter, subdermal scatter, backscatter. Then we also have in specular, we have all of the reflection and specular parameters. For example, we have primary weights, secondary reflections, we have our standard reflection parameters here and different things like that. And then in advanced settings, we have a few different things for, say, indirect illumination and a few other things here for controlling the light map. But we're not going to get into that right now. What we're going to end up doing, however, is further down the road during this tutorial, we're going to end up doing an entire project based around this fast skin shader. So you get to see how to use it, how to work with it, and what these different parameters do more in depth and in more detail. So we're not going to go ahead and do that now in favor of doing it later in more detail. So this is the fast skin shader. And you notice that the light transmits through this shader kind of like the way that skin does, or kind of like a grape, if you will. Okay, then over here on the right we have the fast simple shader. So let's hit 7 to open up the render tree. Double click on the fast simple node, close the render tree. Okay, this is another subsurface scattering shader just like the skin shader, but this one's a little bit different in terms of the parameters and properties of it. It's called the simple shader because it's more simplified than the skin shader. The skin shader, for example, you remember when we were in the diffuse tab, it had tons of parameters that stretched all the way down to about this portion of the screen. You notice that the fast simple has only about half of the parameters of the skin shader in this first tab, which is called surface, not diffuse. Then we have a scattering tab and an advanced settings tab, and the advanced settings tab is very similar to the advanced settings tab of the skin shader. Now in scattering we just have a few parameters like front scattering, back scattering, and then scatter controls. And then down over here in the surface tab we have some diffuse parameters as well as a couple of specular parameters. So there are much less parameters, which means that it's easier to use, but it also limits the effects that you can achieve with this simple shader, because of course it's a simpler shader. So it's a simple shader, which means that it's simpler to use. It also renders a little bit faster than the skin shader because it's less complex, obviously, and it shades a little bit different. If you notice, the simple over here on the right looks a lot different than the skin on the left. The skin on the left looks more like skin. Look at the way that light is affecting this back shadowy part, and then look at the simple shader and the way that light's affecting this back shadowy part of the simple sphere. Now, what can this simple shader be used for, you're thinking? Well, you're probably wondering, well, I got this skin shader which does subsurface scattering, so I could probably just use this one for all my subsurface scattering needs. What in the world do I need this simple shader for? Well, the simple shader is best for doing other types of subsurface scattering materials. Not really human skin, but other things, because human skin's not the only material in the real world that has subsurface scattering. You can use it to, say, do different types of fruits, such as grapes or maybe even strawberries. You can also use it to shade different types of real world objects, say like wax from a candle or different things like that. And if you get very creative, you can even use it to do different types of translucent materials. Say if you're doing some kind of a thin layer of paper or screen. Also, if you're doing curtains or anything like that in architectural visualization, if you get really creative, you can use this to do some interesting objects in ArchViz. Also, there's nothing stopping you from using it to create skin and things like that for monsters or different types of animals and things like that. So it's just really limited to the way that you want to apply them. So I'm going to draw another render region over here, and we're going to continue on with this sphere. And this is the Cook Torrance sphere. We open up the shader attributes here, shader property page. You notice we have a diffuse section here with the diffuse and ambient parameter. We also have specularity. So the specularity parameters are a little bit different than, say, the Phong. We have a roughness parameter, also a refraction parameter. So we can make this look rougher, as you can see, or less rough, make it look a little bit shinier. And there you go. And this shader is good for doing metallic surfaces, but really you could use it for whatever you want. It just depends on how you implement it. So it's just a matter of going in here and playing with the settings till you get a look that you want. And we also have a transparency and reflection tab as well as indirect illumination. So it's a pretty simple shader to use. Let's drag this over here to this sphere. And here we have a totally different shader than what we've been looking at so far, the constant shader. Now the constant shader doesn't even have any tabs. It just has, well, these two parameters, transparency and color. Now you notice that the color is set to white, and the way it renders is completely white. Now, why is this happening? Is this a bug or anything? No, it's not. This is the way that the constant shader works. Basically, it does what the name implies. It performs constant shading throughout the entire object or the entire surface. What that means is that this shader doesn't take into account any type of shading other than constant shading of whatever's plugged into this color slot. So for example, you won't see any specular highlights, you won't see any reflections, you won't see any shadows and things on this the way that you would on a Lambert shader. It just shades in this constant mode. So you're probably wondering, what in the world could this be useful for? Well, this could be useful for many different things. For example, you can use it, sometimes constant shaders can be used as an aid when creating scenes that need compositing. You can also use it to create lights. You can also use it for certain background situations. Say if you're doing an architectural scene and you're doing an interior and there's a window that looks to the outside. Well, instead of building the entire outside world, which would take forever and probably make you miss your deadline with your client, you could take a photograph of a real background, an outside panoramic view or whatnot. You can slap that photo onto a 2D grid, for example, a polygon grid, put it in front of the window like a picture, and then use the constant shader to project that image. That way it looks more realistic than, say, doing that with a Lambert shader, because if you did that with a Lambert shader, it would just look like you put an image on a piece of cardboard as opposed to using a constant shader, which will make it look nice and bright and more realistic. So there's different ways of using this constant shader, and it's there and it's pretty useful. So let's move over to the next one. And this one is the Blinn shader. Now the blend shader is a pretty standard default shader. It's in most 3D programs, including Softimage XSI. You'll see here we have an illumination, transparency, reflection tab, and indirect illumination tab. In illumination, it's pretty simple. It's very similar to the fog. We have our diffuse and our ambient parameters. We also have a specular parameter section here where we can enable and disable our specular highlights. We can also change the color of the specular highlight just like the fog shader. But we also have a roughness and a specular refraction parameter to control the way that this specular highlight looks. So we can make it a more concentrated, more powerful specular highlight, or we can make it more faded out and less apparent. So that's the blend shader for you. It's basically Lambert with these specular parameters slapped on top of it. So let's move over here to this last one. And this one's the Anisotropic Shader. And the Anisotropic Shader is good for doing metals as well as brushed metal surfaces and different types of metallic surfaces. We have some diffuse parameters. We also have some anisotropic specular settings here, so we control the color of the glossiness, which is this highlight right here. We can also control the different orientation of the way that this anisotropic specular parameter works and interacts with the object. For example, if we come in here and start to change some of these settings around, you notice that we can change the way that the highlight looks, and we can control the direction, the orientation of the actual highlight, which is actually a pretty neat little thing that we can do here that you can't do with, say, the blend shader or the fog shader. So this is a very interesting shader you can use for different types of metallic surfaces and basically to imitate brushed metal or rough metal metallic surfaces. Okay, so there we go. There's a quick run through of some of the most common shaders in XSI. That are available to you, as well as some interesting ones like these mental ray subsurface scattering shaders, the simple and the skin shader. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here. After this video, what we're going to do is get started on the actual projects and things like that. So we'll start to get our hands dirty and start to do actual things that are relevant to computer animation, as opposed to just, you know, rendering these little spheres out, which is pretty much useless, other than to point out the different shading models. So next thing we're going to do is get started on those projects and have a little bit of fun using the render tree in XSI. So I'll see you there.